I will provide a Dropbox PDF file in the comments that you can copy and paste for self-scrutiny and analyses. A comprehensive, yet brief clarity, of primary vectors projected and implemented as hypersonic, hypomanic, psychosis inducement of a parapsychology and rabies viral, neurodegenerative dementia and psychotic megalomatic neural reception, induced as a generic entity, hysteria of psychogenic folly. A delusion of two or more. Do consider the potential, possible, probabilities to certainties to determining truth from any and all, delusion, lies, deceit, treachery and illusion. The fluorescence and photoluminescence causality of photon absorption, combined of a liquefaction of distilling chemicalism also referred to as hydrogenesis. As a combination of photosynthesis and photoluminescence of light emission from any form of matter, and water fluidity what is subtly apparent, of a deliberate vector of biohacking via perspiration and metallurgical recombinations, that is significant of the absorption of photons by the corporeal body, as tampering and biohacking fusion, artificially and technologically, has been evidenced. Walter John Kilner, a medical electrician during the 1920s, experimented with a substance, refined from coal tar he called diaconin, what composed of a red film placed between two glass panes. He realized he could distinguish the aura emanation from corporeal bodies, and thus a differentiation of light spectrums correlatively. The substance was subsequently banned in America. What is of the same patternism regarding remote viewing as if integrated as a in tandem framework, associated to parapsychology subsequently privatized and obviously integrated upon a militaristic apparatus as proxy filtering to a privatized extremism of a xenophobic network, that is subtly apparent yet obviously correlative, to world fairs during the mid to late 18th century. The fluorescent emanation and integrations of harmonics, radiology imaging, reverse engineering and Dianetic metaphysical and bioplasmic manufacturing, merged of a photometric memory tampering, that is abstractly a probability, of a fused LED light spectrum's transmission, and conducted as biosub or Dianetic augmentation, pseudoscience and exotic ideology, concept and inception, as interfacing manipulation, repurposed with laser pointer and printer precisions and virtual traversing. The combination of synthetics to organic sensory imposed as spying and bugging brains and harmonic emittance within templated singularities of envelopment, dualities of exotic gestation and multi-frequency mnemonic suggestion, the feasibility of the hypothesis, of mechanisms of transmittance via, optogenetics, and cybernetic witchcraft, is simply emphasized with proper conjecture and analyses. Pseudoscience astrology is a fact, and thus as Dianetic practical appliance, combined of software networking, engineering and technician mechanisms of primary focus of such mnemonic suggestive morbid and contingencies of malevolent impressions. The patterns of which are self-evident, when sensitively aware of the psychopification and victimization that has been involved of indiscriminate overture. The neural programming and reverse engineering upon organics via inorganic parasitic affliction, malignancy and gestation, resulting of a biohacking and nanogel osmosis. I can emphasize the factors involved of a nanoparticle and nanotech emulation intended as a Cylon, cyborg encryption derivative imposture, integrated inclusively as designer seeds and designer synapses, as Dianetic xenophobic hereditary witchcraft and thus genome amalgamation, of organic sperm and ovum eggs and synapses of infiltrated corporeal life forms, as vectors of subterfuge. A data mining compiling specific to regression of memory harnessing, distilling and refineries of brain data temporal flux and fixed measurements, the prosthetic proxy of spectrums of film membranes, and spectrals of pseudoforms is immediately obvious, as vectors of obscene sacrilege and desecration, and devastation, whilst bombarded as subliminal messaging mnemonics, and idioms of databasing and indexing of microbial and anatomy of corporeal bodies. The emphasis is therefore of a memory harvesting, temporal regression of life experiences as if a memory resource specific of intention, to spying and bugging brain and bodily innards and sensory distillery. Pronounced specifically of synthesis against dianoetic intellectual intelligence, a memory harvesting focused against intellect, skills, talents and articulation, to being dissected, spliced, graphed and surveyed, as if biomass territorial disputes, sovereignty and resources committed against brains and synapses, as a virtual superpositioning and wave function pressured as a normality referred to as quantum theory and simulated chaos theorems. A merging of bioenergetic meridian transformation, transitions and PET gene cloning and amalgamation and bionic video, film and computer-generated imagery, and proxied video mechanics of 3D object, transition as modes and spectrums of transformation by a graph, a myriad of mechanism, specific to Doppler, microwave and radar remote viewing techniques, as augmented transmission, incited against the memory of kids and adult humans and transponder matrices of populations of neurons, organs and sensory, utilized media applications, programs and film movies, afflicted as fractal holographical synchronicity, technocratic perversion, and hence shape-shifting projected bionic perversion and as biodynamic, haptic fluidity peripheral and direct membrane filtrations. It is obvious, with adequate emphasis and clarity, of a sophisticated framework of a technocratic, obscenity specific to electronic desecration conducted of opportunism of hatred, malice and jealousy and thought and emotion and dissections, as siphoning example of shanty towns, hungry and thirsty human beings, and victims of artificial scarcity and criminals and mercenaries, and soldiers, and the holism of the population of a civilization as stenciled and traced, destiny narratives combined of strawman directoring subliminally, escalated as after-death frigidity, and after-life contingency folie à deux, as generations performed as present criticalities of body snatching, exacerbated as planned plugs and socket switches reminiscence of binary encoded, heads-up displays and definitive as neural anatomy toxification. infestation and thought form seduction by meridian ambushing, decapitation and displacement, confliction and acclimatized adverse to literal possession of corporeal bodies, combined as cryptid clone derivatives, of gestation by inorganic infestation. All that, and a temporal memory recomposition, reanimation, of frameworks of integrated gigabyte memory, silica and polyester and silicosis, combined of liquefaction and induced overduration, of psychological mass formation and precursory stenciled tracing upon eggs of light blooms. The hydrogenic imposture and chemicalism of caustic corrosion, corruption and confliction, fixated against the brains of organisms. Hence a neurodegenerative macroviral spectrums, that is obvious and emphasized of the example of diaconin dye refined from coal tar refined as a fossil fuel refined from biomatter decadence. The idiom regarding quantum fuels is then so, most prevalent of explanation for what's been an implementation of a neuroinfestation, chemicalism and metamapping, especially of microscopes used to peering at microbes, and a longitudinal spectrum, looking back, as polarized magnification. The clearly evident occurrence, of pixelation, plasma and haptic fluidity, to that of incident reports relative to the Vietnam War of red light spectrum night vision goggles distributed to soldiers and bewildering occurrences of an active neural synaptic and sensory transmission that is quite evident of fixation conducted against the eyeballs and the pupils of the irises, and of premeditated, pseudonym imposture revealed by a such light spectrum, visually exposed to the eyeball sensory, particularly the pupil and the dilation and reminiscence of epilepsy regarding rapid eye movement also referred to as REM sleep, and neural imposture exposed as a monotony of morbid infraction and retraction interactive siphoning, notable of spectral fluorescence, and darkness, as aura and photonic absorption and exsumption siphoning. This education is ample proof of the tracing. Stenciling committed as a biohacking contingency involved as a mass lobotomy via such spectrum analyses, and a horrid example of the mutation threats and symptoms of causation of cognitive decline, and the obvious correlation, when I emphasize, body snatching and pseudo-fermentations committed against actual corporeal bodies, combined of a possessive uniform monotony, of acclimatized assertion and affirmation and confirmation, committed as gruesome photometric, chemical and bioenergetic meridians combined of a cellular bioenergetic filtering and processing, emphasized of a senescent cellular, neurodegenerative necrosis and hypocrisy of cell renewal and division, what really being emphasis of a refinery data processing polarized as dianetic and abstract warfare and thought form weaponism against the corporeal bodies, and conducted as singular dualities, to what posing as a appalling unsanctimonious elementary of branded constituencies. When I emphasized of fiber optic cabling and ecology and chemical surveying, emphasized of periodic tables, the neural dissemination combined of a metamapping, meta-recording, and a liquefaction chemical brine of relevance to desalination liquid. Hydrogen, ocean water, implemented of a hydrogenic spectral film and degrees of delirium and dehydration illness. The spectrum peripheral neuroinfestation, primarily integrated of a hydrogenesis and pseudonym photoscopic filtration. The emphasis becomes easily apparent, of a photonic lasing of absorption intended as matrices of multisensory, multi-frequency, parapsychology, sensory committance of hybridization formulas, of exotic apothecary and alchemy, especially evident of a pseudoscience dianetic imposture, as modes and echelons of a definition of golem, as automaton synthesis, and artificially committed database. Harvesting and filtration, against corporeal brains and bodies and uniform, conformism specific to AI software and mnemonic cueing acclimatization significant of a assumptive, presumptive sacrilege, subliminally imposed, as nets and webs of neurons and brains and synapses, and an emphasis of chemical, gaseous and metallurgical gradients and ingredients, such as the neurotransmitter known as acetylcholine, a nucleic chemical and neurotransmitter closely associated to nicotinic receptors of polypeptides, and thus the neural synapses involved of organic function and the introduction, of inorganic and foreign biomatter, being a vector of infiltration, especially of a manual introduction to the nervous system, that is evident of a fungal hyphae restriction, and a cloud-computed cybertronic printing, feasibly evident as an artificial inorganic vector and hence of dysfunctional, sacrilegious microbial focused and rehearsed presets and defaults, designed to stagnating brain and cognition via synthetic filtering, and ultimately as a neural harvesting, lobotomy and substitution threat, especially over duration, committed as a remote to local viewing architectural radiology reverse engineered, technology and manufactured as surgical precisions of cosmetic, prosthetic and artificial nodes of horrifying desecration, of servitude, victimizing and prisoning beings of matters, to such pseudoscience apparatus and databasing contingencies of generic filtrations of entity identities, as memory anagrams, and photometric, photonic graphic and synthetic, inorganic sensory emittents filtrated as biosiver mechanisms of anthropomorphism, via conduits of neurally printed databasing, biodynamic static nodes, and sadistic extremes of artificial haptic spectral molestation and tampering, intended as abrasions against the brain, organs, flesh, blood and bones, senses, memory and psyche, min-macro murderous neural debauchery and bodily innards devastation, whilst conflicted as local area causalities and wide area networking symptoms fixated against as cognitive deficiencies, as if causations, yet manipulated by causations, as if abstract camouflage and division techniques, quite the emphasis, of Pokemon, Tamagotchis, video character animation and digital mechanical vectors. So, being aware of the subliminal handicapping, behavioral imposture, the conductive means, incident reporting and self-diagnostics, and sensitive awareness, is thus of absolute necessity, especially when deciphering the behavioral impact of other beings, especially of proximity. There's inclusional involvements inclusively, nothing is exempt, and beings whom willingly abstain, are irrefutably of immediate concern. Be your own self-defense force, brethren, because there is no doubt about it, we have been getting attacked, whilst alluded as mindless automatons.